Okay, here's the last segment for stoichiometry. So this is going to take us through how to calculate the amount of excess when you have a limiting reactant. Because if one is limiting, the other reactant is considered the excess reactant. So the way you do this is that you start with the reaction limiter, excuse me, or the limiting reactant. And so we had 21 grams of silver, which we had identified in the previous segment as our limiting reactant. And so the first thing I would do is I would use the mole conversion. So 1 mole of silver over the atomic mass of silver, 107.87 grams. Then I would look at the mole ratio between sulfur and silver, and that would be the two reactants and what their mole ratio is. And what I know is that from that balanced equation that there's 1 mole of sulfur for every 2 moles of silver. And then I would convert the to the moles of sulfur to the grams of sulfur using the molar mass conversion, 32.06 grams of sulfur for every 1 mole. And I find 3.12 grams of sulfur. So what does that mean? So this proves that if all of the 21.0 grams of silver reacts, then only 3.12 grams of sulfur will actually participate in the reaction, and there will be excess left over. And so to find the excess, we'll take the given amount of sulfur that was given in our original problem. If we go back to that slide, it was 8 grams of sulfur was originally given. I subtract the amount that's used up, the amount that participates in the reaction, and this is the amount that is in excess. And so that's all you have to do to calculate the amount of excess. You start with the limiting reagent, you compare using your mole ratio, the other reactant, and then you convert it to grams. We say that's how much participates in the reaction, and the rest would be what's left over or the excess amount. It doesn't react. And then the other calculation that we need to know how to do is how to calculate percent yield. So let's say that we perform this reaction between silver and sulfur, and we know that we start out with 21 grams of silver, 8 grams of sulfur, and we actually produce, when we perform the experiment in the lab, we actually produce 18.4 grams of silver sulfide. And then the question would be, what is your percent yield? And so the formula for percent yield is actual yield divided by theoretical yield times 100. So I'm going to take the amount that I actually produced in my laboratory experiment, which I stated here was 18.40, divide by the theoretical yield that I had calculated back here when I was trying to find my limiting reagent. And then I just have to divide that out. So it's actual over theoretical times 100, and I get a 76.3%. And what that tells me is that I produce 76.3% of what's expected. Very rarely do you get 100% when you're calculating a percent yield. You're going to calculate percent yield in your lab that's due next week, and you'll probably have a pretty good yield in that experiment, only because it's a virtual lab. And so those are typically set up to get pretty close to 100. Okay, so that's it. See you next week.